Oh, wow, that's new. Did you guys hear that? Okay, great. That didn't used to happen. That surprised me. I was like, whose voice is that?
The lawyers did that. The lawyers got involved.
All right, I'm going to start. So we're going live now. Have a great event.
Thanks.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Natasha Joukovsky, presenting her new book, The Portrait of a Mirror. She'll be talking with Lauren Oyler, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Natasha, Lauren, and the team at the Overlook Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. So the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Portrait of a Mirror, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Natasha's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I've dropped the buy link in the chat and I'll drop it again in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for tonight is Lauren Oyler. Her essay on books and cultures appear regularly in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, the London Review of Books, Harper's, Book Forums, and other publications. Her acclaimed first novel, Fake Accounts, was published in February by Catapult and was a Greenlight First Editions Club selection for the month. She will be speaking with our featured author, Natasha Joukovsky. She holds a BA in English from the University of Virginia and an MBA from New York University's Stern School of Business. She spent 5 years in the art world, working at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York before pivoting into management consulting. She lives in Washington, D.C. Her new book, The Portrait of a Mirror, is a stunning reinvention of the myth of Narcissus as a modern novel of manners about two young, well-heeled couples whose parallel lives intertwine over the course of the summer. The book has been praised by a multitude of fellow writers, including Gia Tolentino, Grant Ginder, Aaron Summers, Paul Barolsky, and Emily Temple, who says, The Portrait of a Mirror is an absolute delight, an intellectually dazzling, deliciously wicked novel about love, art, illusion, and modernity. Not to mention a pitch-perfect satire of New York's beautiful people. I devoured it in a state of ecstasy, of ecstatic thrall, feeling quite as hypnotized and insatiable as Narcissus himself, and not the least bit sorry about it. Natasha is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Lauren and with all of you. Please take it away, Natasha.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to read from the opening of chapter 1 of The Portrait of a Mirror. There is no greater compliment in this world than being the uncooperative catalyst of another person's misery, if not all-out self-destruction. The critical word here is uncooperative. It is easy, lazy, and dishonorable to deliberately distress another human being. But to do so unintentionally, or better yet, unwillingly, for one's mere presence to cause another pain, not by any act of violence, but by the force of the bottomless pool that is unrequited love, that pool that both draws and prevents the other from moving closer. To be loved and not to love back. This is the definition of power. It's a state of affairs that most privileged, well-educated, self-involved people take great pains to shape in their favor. In the truest mark of artistic mastery, C. Wesley Range IV made it seem effortless. So highly attractive to women was West that, at first glance, for the many, many girls he had disappointed, it might have been tempting to paint a 21st century Rick von Sloniker. Tall, rich, good-looking, stupid, dishonest, conceited, a bully, a liar, a drunk, and a thief, an egomaniac, and probably psychotic. In reality, he was only about half of these things, and if West was a bit of a devil, he was the kind with whom you'd sympathize. At nearly 30, West was still boyishly handsome, with an Ivy League aesthetic perforating his hipster urbanism and 85% of a Henley-winning physique. He was kind to children, respectful of the elderly, and attentive to dogs. He rarely drank alcohol precisely because he knew he had the tendency to overdo it. The lies he told were generally engineered to spare hard feelings, and the main recipient of such lies was himself. With the recent tidy valuation of his tech startup, Echo, one might have predicted an uptick in ego, but his oldest friends would insist there had been no change. New acquaintances would scoff that he came from money anyway, until they learned the sorry state of his trust, at which point even Zuccotti Park populist skeptics had been known to forgive him the suffix and develop a crush. Upon closer inspection, they found West could almost pass for self-made. If anything, he spent too much time at work. Factoring in his polite yet straightforward general manner, discretion in sexual encouragement and discouragement, discernment in those choices, and most especially his unwavering commitment to albeit serial monogamy, it was impossible to brand West a womanizer, let alone a rake. It was a formidable talent making women feel valued and respected. It shouldn't have been, but it was. Rarely making the first move, even less often a promise, Wes's quiet self-assurance and Sadie Hawkins' approach tended to attract the kind of woman to whom Wes was most attracted. Independently minded and forward-thinking enough to proposition a man, confident enough in their own desirability for that man to be him. His real specialty, though, was breakups. Wes's ready willingness to have an uncomfortable 30, maybe 60-minute conversation and be cleanly, respectably done with things starkly broke ranks with long-established practice in male-to-female relationship termination theory. If the great lengths and dramatic unpleasantness his friends accepted to avoid such encounters boggled Wes's mind, his own compassion and transparency shocked the hell out of them. But to Wes, empathetic, definitive communication was a kind of secular Pascal's wager, one of those rare pragmatisms with the added benefit of humanistic appearance. In the absence of ugly breakup mechanics, most women ostensibly bore their post-West devastation and ironic nostalgia, if not pride of conquest. Those who did resort to the darker comforts of fiction were hardly believed anyway. Such was the sterling reputation of Charles Wesley Range IV, indelible to the point of immunity, even on occasion from the truth. And I will stop there.
Thank you, that was great. Congratulations again on your amazing novel. I wanted to talk, we were just talking before we came on about like how to classify the novel. And we were talking about whether you think of it as a satire or a comedy of manners or sort of like these kinds of terms. And we were talking about, I was saying like, I didn't know if I thought of it as a satire because it's too real. And I was wondering if you could talk about whether you see it that way or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it inclusively as falling into several different genres as opposed to, not being one thing or the other. When I really go back to Northrop Frye's theory of modes. And so I was looking to combine a few different ones. So, one of my favorite novels is Ulysses. And, that's where a lot of the idea of taking on a myth for modern times came from, and that that sort of push from the thematic type satirical novels. When you push the boundaries far enough, Northrop Frye says you almost come back to the original kind of mythic mode, right? So I was trying to push the ironic all the way back to the mythic while also pushing it back to the low mimetic in line with Austen and Henry James. And so it is a comedy of manners, right? It absolutely is. And it's also an ironic novel, I think. And it's also a mythic novel. So I would use the word and a lot. And if I was forced to put it in a box, I would ultimately bucket it as a thematic novel because that's where I started, a thematic ironic novel.
Okay, so that's where you started. I wanted to ask also how the book started for you and like, how did you initially sort of like think about your goals, right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, the thing that I started with was really Vivian's exhibition and the ideas about art itself. So the ideas in the novel, in that sense, go back 15 years to when I was an undergrad and studying art history with Paul Borolsky at UVA. And he taught this class called Art and Myth, where you read a chapter of Ovid's Metamorphoses each week and looked at all of the related art. And I mean, nothing captivated me like the myth of Narcissus. I wouldn't have
Really?
used the word recursion until like 10 years later, but that's what I loved about it. The endless layers of self-referential, I mean, really play. Like there's a delight to it, even though it's sad. It's funny and sad and so human and emotional at the same time as being kind of tongue-in-cheek. So that tone that Ovid strikes there, and the ideas about art and about like Narcissus being a painter, like Alberti states, and Vivian quotes in her exhibition text. That was the genesis. And then I think that just the world that I was observing in 2015, and having worked in the art world, then at that time I was, a couple years into my consulting job, and just seeing the way people move through the world, I want to say, it just, the two things seemed so perfectly put together. And then actually, as time went on, at the time I just wanted to do a, modern, as in right now, reinterpretation of the myth of Narcissus. But as time went on and we got into the, build up to Trump and everything, it seemed more and more and more perfect. That the idea of 2015 being this year, like right as at the peak of, everybody's self-love and admiration, right before you realize that narcissism is actually an existential threat. And it's the same moment that Caravaggio paints in the painting that's on the cover of the novel. It's like that moment right before everything spirals out of control.
Yeah. And we should say, I guess, as by way of plot summary, if you haven't read the book, it's basically about, there are two central couples. There's Wes, whose full name is, can you remind me what his full name is?
Charles Wesley Range the fourth.
Okay. All of the names, like Natasha's own name, are excellent in this book. Okay. So there's Wes and Diana Whalen.
Yeah.
Or Diana. Yeah. And then there's Dale McBride and Vivian Flores. So Vivian is Vivian. Okay, it's very well. It's like incredibly structured. It's so complicated and intertwined. All of the sort of like threads in the relationships between everyone, and you relate that so well to some of the other themes of the book, which I hope we get to talk about. But it's very hard to explain. So basically, there are these two couples. Vivian is a curator and has this show on at the Met. She's a visiting curator from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and her show is called
Art and Myth.
Art and Myth. Yes. And so she is doing that. Dale McBride is a management consultant in Philadelphia. Diane, who is married to Wes. Wes is a startup guy, tech founder, with a ruined inheritance, but still quite wealthy. And Diana is also a management consultant, and she gets to go to Philadelphia to work with Dale. And then Vivian has to go to New York to work on her Met exhibition. And so there's a crisscrossing of interests and characters, I guess. And then basically the role of the Vivian, what I wanted to ask about is Vivian, towards the end of the book, you say, you describe her sort of mode with this exhibition is a curatorial quest to demonstrate Ovid's outsized contemporary cultural relevance. And she has this sort of Instagram campaign related to the exhibition involving a mirror, and you take pictures of yourself in the mirror, and there's the picture, and it just like sort of is recursive and is infinitely recursive. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about Ovid's outsized contemporary cultural relevance. And you talked a little bit about it, but I was wondering if you could tease it out a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that once you read the Metamorphoses in particular, you'll start seeing Ovid everywhere. I mean, it's not just in art. You'll find, and one of the things that was so cool about, this class that I took in undergrad is we were encouraged to look for the contemporary references to Ovid. And you'll see Ovidian themes in the crossword puzzle. You'll see, you'll see it. So many recent novels have tackled Ovidian themes and are mythic retellings. I think specifically of the recent Stacey Swan's recent book Olympus, Texas too. I mean, there's the and also I think the tone, right? Ovid was very, very self-aware, and self-awareness is kind of, I think the modern ethos in a certain American demographic right now. And your novel actually kind of gets into that with the self-awareness too. It's almost you're like self-aware of your self-awareness of your self-awareness of your self-awareness, right?
You're not supposed to be too self-aware because it's obnoxious.
Yes.
Right.
But you also need to be,
Right.
So it's a double-edged sword. So I think that in that way too, and tonally, and the way that Ovid weaves stories and stories and stories. And I mean, his narrative is kind of set up the same way most computer algorithms are. Like the recursive nature of Ovid is part of what makes his work so relevant, because I think that recursion is, what's whether we like it or not, underlying so many of the processes and decisions and systems and ways of interacting we have. For instance, when I was thinking about writing this book, and one of the reasons I was so interested in relationships was the idea of interpersonal recursion. Like that when I'm talking to you, I'm less thinking about talking to you and more thinking about what you're thinking about what I'm saying, right? I'm doing this live thing to try and read your mind at all times. And there's, levels and layers of that. And the increasing sophistication also goes toward absurdity, right?
Yeah. And I think too, the characters in your book are all sort of strategic in all of their social interactions. And I think like there's a tendency to react negatively to that, I think, right? And to see that as sort of like somehow almost evil, like immoral to be strategizing and sort of trying to like anticipate what your interlocutor is going to say or how they're going to receive something and to adjust yourself. But I wonder if it's not just a feature of this kind of high stakes elite milieu, but pretty much everything, right?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it seems so evil. We pretend not to see each other doing it, but we're also all doing it because, like you said, the stakes are really high. And I mean, you say the wrong thing on Twitter and I mean, goodbye. Right. Like,
right.
So of course, you have to do it, but you have to do it in such a way that it looks like you're not doing it, which is, speaks to the general theme of effortless mastery overall and manufactured nonchalance. There's a whole article on this recently that I chuckled at.
Wait, what article is that?
I'm like, of course, I'm totally blanking on it, but I will look it up and send it to you after.
Right. Yeah, I would love to read it. I think too, like all of these characters are very witty. They're very witty. They're all constantly bantering and like constantly like it's just they're quipping at each other all the time. And there's really like one scene where one character like falls apart and doesn't make any sense, and it's like so striking because everything else is so calculated and everything else is so like, how am I going to get what I want? How am I going to use this to, and how am I, all of that, they all think of their interactions in terms of like winning the interaction.
Yeah.
Right. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that relates to consulting, which is a big sort of like almost like a setting, or like it's like a theme, but it's also like the kind of backdrop to all of the sort of romantic foibles of the book as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like a generally competitive world, right?
Mhm.
Like, it speaks to the strategy that you're talking about too. I think that, this is a very marketable skill to be able to look into the crystal ball, if you will, and, develop a cogent strategy for achieving your goals, for winning, right? And I think there's been such a collapse in recent years of professional and personal lives that it's inevitable for there to be some crossover and back and forth. And, when you're training your brain every day to do this in a professional environment, like, sure, you're going to turn around and do that with your spouse too. Like, you're used, and especially if you're good at it, like, it's really hard to just turn that off. And especially if you're good at it, you get like real desserts for it. Like, there's benefits to being to being good at this, and they're tangible, and it's very highly valued by our society, so long as you pretend you're not actually doing it.
Right, because it's supposed to be secondary, which is also interesting, right? It's really like the center of this novel, I think, in a lot of ways, but it is supposed to be kind of like behind the scenes and like operating in the background. And the vocabulary that you use like is so, I mean, I'm sure it's like just exactly the same vocabulary you use. It seems totally realistic to me, but it's like very impenetrable, and it's like more difficult to follow than any of the stuff about, Roman poets or Ovid, or there's so many sort of like high flown references in the novel, but all of those seem to me at least like very straightforward, and it's the like management consulting lingo and like the tech, right, that becomes like alienating, at least for me. Maybe that's
Lauren, I think that's because you're you, though. Right? You work, you're a woman of letters, and of course that's going to be second nature to you to listen to Ovid and to read about that. I would venture that the people that I work with, I actually had an email from someone that I work with the other day saying that like data-driven tech, the line in the second chapter about like data-driven tech blueprint, like hit way too close to home for his personal life. So I like this is a matter of perspective. And I think, when you think about writing a novel and you want to write the novel that only you can write, like the intersection of Ovid and consulting, I felt pretty confident that was the novel that I could speak as an expert in both areas. I guess my hope is that for someone like you, the business and consulting stuff isn't so acronymy and difficult to follow that it turns you off. And then also I hope that, my consulting friends will enjoy and not be, feel like they can relate to the parts about art.
Yeah, well, I think that the parts about art, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit. So the way that you have sort of unexplained references, and I'm sure there are some that I didn't even catch either, but there's a lot of like very clear, cogent analysis of art that the characters themselves are doing, right? So Dale gives Vivian Anna Karenina, right? Or like there's sort of naturalistic and incorporations of these things, right? So the exhibition, you hear Vivian giving her sort of like exhibition talk. You see like paragraphs of her explaining how the paintings relate to the contemporary and what it's all about. And I think that is kind of what I'm talking about. And I wonder if that's something you did consciously, or if it just seems like the natural way to represent these kinds of like literary intellectual concerns in a kind of realistic way, because this is something I think about as well.
Well, I think there's also just a limited appetite for philosophical novels and putting a like
No,
putting
I don't
the
know.
yeah, no, seriously, I wanted the novel to be both very, very philosophical, but also commercial and marketable. I made a conscious decision to try and thread that needle and be everything to everyone, right? And maybe you it's a really, really tough line, right? Because
Right.
you can end up being nothing to everyone.
Right.
But I was going for the full thing, and to me it seemed the most approachable way to get philosophical ideas in there, because that to me, that was the reason to write the novel, was the ideas about art. It was my starting point. It was this is the first work of fiction I've ever written. Like it's not the medium that I gravitate more to nonfiction, but it's I let's be honest, I got rejected from all the art history PhD programs I applied to, and this seemed like the best way to get my ideas out there. And I think it's entertaining too. And the more I wrote of it, like the more fun it got, and the more I enjoyed writing fiction, and thought, okay, maybe really, really, I should be doing this.
So were you intimidated to start? Like, how did you initially kind of like start thinking about fiction in this way? Because I agree, I think it's a great vehicle for all sorts of things. It like it's just very capacious, like it can fit lots of stuff.
Yeah, it will. I mean, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Ulysses and the Wasteland, and how they're the twin pillars of modernism, by returning to myth, and and how these documents came to be. And I only realized like 10 years later that I was building myself a roadmap to do the same thing they were doing. And because I wasn't in the literary world, because I didn't get an MFA, because I wasn't around folks doing that, nobody told me, and I didn't know that you're like not supposed to think of Oscar Wilde and Jane Austen as your comps. So I thought about them as my comps, and and I only started really reading contemporary fiction after I finished the book. And I think that in some ways it was just like the hubris of not knowing, and nobody telling me that I couldn't try and write a great work in line with my favorite books, which are mostly by dead people.
Right. Yeah, I think too. Did you have like resistance to that, and when you were trying to, maybe this is too personal, but like was it odd to have this realization afterwards? And like how did you start reacting to contemporary fiction when you sort of came to it, having written a novel already? Right.
I mean, it's been a mixed bag, right? I feel like I have encountered greatness that I didn't realize was out there, right? Like I loved your novel so much. I loved Tori Peters' Detransition Baby so much. And there's so many really, really, really good books that I didn't realize were out there. And maybe and I realized maybe my book is in some ways more redundant than I realized, right? And maybe other people are doing similar things, but I'm also really, really grateful that I didn't have that while I was writing, and I only came to it after. And it makes me nervous about writing a second book, to be honest with you, because there's almost a taboo against comparing yourself to the dead great authors. But then that was very difficult, that like basically everybody that I was thinking of, with a few exceptions when I was writing the book, was in that category. I didn't realize that the taboo was there. So I do think that knowing that, and being a little bit preoccupied with manners and etiquette, that's going to make I'm worried about that more with the second book.
Right. Also, just to remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and I'll either ask them live if they fit, or we'll have them at the end, but we'll talk for about 15 more minutes. Or if there are no questions, we'll talk for the rest of the time, but just a reminder. So speaking of all these references, you have a set of appendices at the end of the novel, which is really interesting. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about why you decided to add those. So you have Appendix A, which is called Anxieties of Influence, and you've got a list of novels and novellas, poetry, philosophy, nonfiction, humor, essays, plays and musicals, film and television, and also a soundtrack. And then you have some art reproductions, basically. Some there you call select artifacts, which relate, or some of the paintings that are discussed in the book. And you have one more. You just have three. Have three. Yeah. Why did you do that? It's also kind of unusual, I think, for a novel, particularly a contemporary novel, to have like an appendice or an index.
Yeah. I mean, I submitted the book with two of the three. So I submitted the book with the soundtrack and the images. The images, I think, for this book are pretty understandable, right?
Yeah, I like that too. You can look at it's always better to look at them.
Yeah, it's super ekphrastic. Like the images are so central to the book. Like, before, when I was submitting it, it didn't have this cover, right? Like, which is the central image, but there's other ones that play a really big role. And I wanted the big ones to, be visible, because I think they enrich the text. I'm very interested in, in intertextuality and the back and forth interplay with, word and image, across time, right? How Caravaggio is reinterpreting Ovid, and then I'm reinterpreting Caravaggio, and there's this back and forth over centuries, with between words and images. So that one I feel like is the most obvious. Okay, sure. The soundtrack, I just when I was writing, I guess as a antidote to my Joycean impulse to just throw Easter eggs everywhere and have references that go like that reference references.
Oh yeah, and also reference the book itself, which I quite like. I mean, obviously I like that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's a line where Julian says, like, I gave myself as a reference for myself, and it's all self-referential. But with I as an antidote to that kind of very deliberate, like putting allusions everywhere and embedding them really, really deeply, I had in my mind as I was writing I was literally felt like I was watching a movie of what I was writing. And so that smoothness was, those were kind of my two tests. Like, am I getting the superficial surface, and then am I getting what's beneath the pool too? And I wanted that surface to be, shiny enough and smooth and cinematic enough, I'll say, that if you didn't catch the Easter eggs, you wouldn't, like, no sweat. You're not going to be like, oh, I missed something. You're just not going to notice it at all. But then, obviously if you do, it'll be enriching. The third one, which is actually the first appendix on anxieties of influence, was actually something that my wonderful editor, Chelsea, asked me to add to, because I like had annotated one of I think it was maybe the second or third pass. I had annotated it with a few of the Easter eggs that, I wasn't sure whether or not people had caught. And she's like, you've got to, call attention to some of this so that people who are inclined will like take a look. And we thought that the best way to do that would be to, not get into like an MLA bibliography, but just write an accessible list of the many works of, different media that were hugely influential to the book. Again, going back to Joyce and Eliot and my long-standing fascination with them. I don't think anybody reading this would be like, oh, Joyce. Maybe
no offense, but no.
Yeah. But yeah, I couldn't resist kind of pulling that in, I guess.
Yeah, and I have this like very strong memory of like learning to close read The Wasteland, right? And you have to like really have an annotation with you, and you have to have someone explain it to you, because it's just like you can't know, right? What the fuck he's talking about. and it's like, so it's just, that's like how I learned to read. I assume that you learned to read in a similar way. And to read contemporary fiction now, it's just really not like that. And I think probably you should look at Patricia Lockwood's novel.
I've read it.
Well, it's just, I think I approach the references in that, the sort of internet references, in the same way, which is like, maybe you need a codex to decipher them.
I think her book is the closest thing I've read to Joyce since Joyce. It is huge. I mean, she's been compared to Joyce and kind of the press around it. I think her book is very, very interesting. And I will say that I think that I was going for a similar thing. I mean, she's talking about Twitter in 2017, right?
Right.
I'm more like directly taking the roots through Joyce back to Homer kind of thing. But they're both novels that, I mean, I don't want to speak for her. I was trying to write a book that would be temporal temporal to 2015, but that, in 50 years would, get a Gifford edition to explain all the references. And we'll tell you that Sylvan Scene is a reference to The Wasteland, which is a reference to Paradise Lost, right? And the chain throughout time.
Right, but also Rick von Swanneker, like,
yes, Rick von
in Metropolitan, to know what that is. And also he's not a main character in Metropolitan, right? Like he's the
bad guy in Metropolitan.
Yeah, he's the bad guy, but
he has a couple good scenes, but the real, I mean, the good scene in that, that italicized quote that I read is a direct quote from Metropolitan. It's one of the other characters that's talking about
giving him.
So much of my book is characters talking about each other and gossip and secondhand and the layers, how things get distorted with each retelling.
Yeah. Someone has asked, because we were just talking about this, I thought I'd throw it in. Someone's asked, how might the plot or overall tone atmosphere of the book have been different if you had chosen to set it a couple of years later during the Trump era?
Oh man, I think it would have been, all I can say about this is that the next book I'm writing, I'm now trying to write in the Trump era. I think that the tone is, the language and style is maybe the same, but the tone is, is different, right? Because there's actually a whole paragraph on how this book takes place in peaceable times and the difference between peaceable times and, and times that require the emotional urgency, I guess I'd say. So I think that it would be very hard to write this book with its subject matter and froth in those years. I think you'd have trouble taking their problems seriously.
Well, that's what's interesting too, because it's so seamlessly done. It's very intricate, but it's very like smooth. And there's a sense of them as being sort of, the characters as being sort of like at one with their environment. And partially that's because they're sort of clueless, maybe not clueless, but like they are really in their environment and they don't seem to like particularly care about other environments. And they are very worldly, sort of superficially, right? So I think like in the Trump years, they have to, you're going to still be having, affairs in the Trump years, but you're going to be constantly like wondering if this is wrong of you to be doing, not because it's wrong for you to cheat on your husband, but like because now is not the time for having affairs, right?
The problem with that is it sets the baseline for drama much higher, right? Like this is part of the thing about a comedy of manners, right? It is you need the baseline of like what's urgent to be quite low so that fundamentally low stakes things can feel extremely high stakes, because in those environments they are, which is this is part of the reason that I was so taken with and loved Rumaan Alam's novel Leave the World Behind, because it's very interesting, the idea of taking a country house novel of manners and then taking it where he takes it and very surprising. And I think that's actually what this book would have looked like if you said it during the Trump years, because it has to go somewhere just way darker than it was going to. I had a very good idea of most of the book in terms of just high level plot and the two couples and what would happen to them, setting up a showdown between guilty seeming innocence and innocent seeming guilt very on. But I actually had two endings. I wasn't sure which one I was going to use until I got pretty far along. I think that I would have, if it was set during the Trump years, I think I would have had to have gone with the other ending.
I want to know what the other ending is, but does that give away this ending if you say what the other ending
I don't think it gives.
Can you tell me what it is?
No. The second ending was one that's closer to life. So the character of Julian Papasfidecia is very precisely based on my wonderful late friend Evan Thomas, to whom the book is dedicated, and anyone who will know him who knew him will recognize him immediately. And he died in 2018 of a glioblastoma, and the other ending was involved the most likable character in the novel, I think, in true tragedy, and him dying, and and kind of then all of the shenanigans seeming kind of silly and stupid, right? But I couldn't do that to him in fiction.
Yeah, I think I like the ending. You also have a very good, I won't ruin it, but there's a very good reference to the ending in the middle of the book that sort of foreshadows it. But I thought that the ending, so there have been a lot of contemporary novels that have this sort of oh no.
I drank.
Sorry. That have this sort of catastrophic apocalyptic ending. There's just been a lot of this stuff and sort of characterizes, I think, Trump literature. And I think the ending of your book, it's not apocalyptic in any way, but it's very real. It seems very realistic and very, not to give anything away, but very catastrophic and totally pitch perfect, I think. And
I'm so happy you think that the end is catastrophic, because while I've been very happy to read, reviews and things that say the novel's hilarious, but I think the ending of the novel is extremely sad.
Yeah, no, it's really sad and very apt, I think. As a
sad, but not serious sad in the kind of way that the other ending would have been. I mean, I don't know if this book is a book where you can really ruin the end. I
think so. I think it's very important that we not ruin.
Okay, we are not.
This is a real driving force of the plot. Is that? Trust me on this one.
Okay, I will. But I'm glad. I was trying to strike a real. I mean, there's a lot of paradoxes in the novel, and I'm very interested in paradox and discontinuity. And the ending having something that should be a comedy be very, very, very sad was exactly what I was going for. Also, if The Graduate is top of mind.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask just a really basic question, which is how would you characterize your process, your writing, and maybe scheduling as well, since you have a day job?
I'm going to maybe be the most annoying person ever, which is I wrote this novel completely linearly, starting with the first sentence and writing through till the end. It was very, very, very slow. And I did, I would think of things randomly and write them down. And this is why I love Scrivener, because I'll have all of these fragments but the actual drafting is super, 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 super linear. And also just once I had a first draft, it was basically done. I queried agents and got an agent within a couple of weeks, and there was 2 rounds of edits with my agent pretty light, like, 5,000 out of 80,000 words, not big. And then a couple, only one round of content edits with my editor at Overlook. So I'm a diamond polisher, but a very smart person told me once that there's two kinds of writers. There's word vomiters and diamond polishers.
I took that class.
You did?
It came from, I mean, Anne Fadiman, unless it came from someone else that she took it from. I can't remember.
This is the only writing workshop I've ever taken ever. It was in high school when
Really?
Some, well-regarded author who I have no idea, do not remember anymore. It could have been, it may well have been that person in Connecticut.
It was in Connecticut?
Yeah.
I think probably, I don't know. We'll have to talk about this later. It's obnoxious.
And I am I've tried to be a word vomiter. I'm a diamond polisher through and through of the most extreme nature. I'm
both. I want to go straight through, particularly when I wrote my novel. I wrote it straight through, but I skipped, I would be write something lazily and then go back and fix it. And that's a devastating thing that I don't recommend anybody do.
I can't do it. I can't move on until, and I can go to the length of a paragraph, but nothing longer than a paragraph before it's polished. And not that I don't revise, sometimes I have to go back, particularly with smart comments from people I trust, like my agent and my editor. And obviously they made the book so much better. Don't get me wrong. They really, really did. But there's not, in terms of volume, there's not that much that's different. It was really, really targeted, laser focused, Mohs surgery.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you find the time? So someone has said, I'm so intrigued by your career arc, earning a Stern MBA and becoming a consultant, writing an art world novel. She asked, he asked, are you still a strategy consultant by day? And I was wondering if you could also just talk about how you wrote this while doing that.
Yeah. So I still work in the consulting world, but I have gone internal, which is much better for traveling. When you have a 2-year-old, I don't travel anymore. I work from home all the time. And it's also better just for work-life balance in general. So I still work in consulting, but it's recursive. I'm the consultant to the consultant. Specifically, I do pricing strategy these days. But in terms of how I found the time, my husband retired from his law job in 2016, and I took a leave of absence from my job for 9 months. And I wrote 60% of the novel in those 9 months. And then it took me another 3.5 years when I was also working to finish the rest of it. So it went a lot faster when I was on leave of absence and writing 12 hours a day.
Right. Did you feel pressure to finish it during the leave of that? What was it wasn't a delightful creative experience?
I'm not sure. Parts of it were delightful, but I started it really in earnest right after my 30th birthday, when I realized I was going to die. And I had a burning desire to write this novel, and it wasn't always a pleasure cruise. It was it was an existential, this has to be done kind of thing. And I felt it the whole time, up until the novel sold, that it was, that it was a burning platform, basically.
Someone asked, as you were writing, was there ever a problem with the plot that you can figure out how to solve, and what was it, and how did you end up moving forward?
Because I had a very clear skeleton outline and almost no flesh under that. So because I had such a strong skeleton, I didn't really have that a plot issue at any time. What I will say is, for me, the the book is much more about theme and style than plot. So I did have one chapter that when I finished it, I threw out and started over. My husband read chapter 12. He told me it was bad. And I started chapter 12 again. And I took the bulk of chapter 12 and later used it in chapter 17, the first version. So I really didn't have that. I'm sorry to be disappointing.
Well, it's just interesting because the social relations are so, it's not really plot, but it's like the social relations are so intricate and like interwoven. And I imagine like, how do you structure, because I'm like not, I just like couldn't do it. I just couldn't do that kind of thing because like I am not organized and I'm extremely impatient and like just get bored of this sort of thing quite quickly.
But I actually think that our novels are really similar in this way, and that there's a very clear overarching plot, but like the plot is almost beside the point and subservient to the sentence level. What consumed me, what kept me up at night were the sentences, and the sentence that I was working on not being good enough for me to move on to the next one, that there was something wrong with the cadence, that the cadence wasn't as elegant as I wanted, that it didn't properly bridge, that there was an awkward gap. Like I wanted it to be very smooth and very very surface like, right? And that was what really tripped me up and made things hard, that each individual word and putting together sentences, not the plot.
That's interesting. I saw somewhere that you described, I think it was like, it seemed to me that this was a description that you had written, but maybe I'm wrong. It's written in a quote unquote traditional style. And I wonder if you can explain what you mean by that.
Well, I'm there really hyper consciously referencing tradition in the individual talent, okay. And that the idea of a traditional novel having the historical sense and more than your generation and your bones. And I think from a stylistic perspective, I think it's traditional in the sense of Austen and Henry James and Edith Wharton and George Eliot, right? That it's a novel that if you took away the subject matter, I think the language is pretty 19th century. And that's kind of what I'm referring to there.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting, but now I wanted to ask, though it is quite traditional, there is a recurring motif of Taco Bell, and I'm wondering, because I understand exactly what this means, like what this signifies, and I'm wondering like why you have these sort of like elite young characters eating Taco Bell all the time.
Well, I mean, they're doing it ironically, right? Like they're showing there, this is their self-awareness showing, right? And the desire to show how elite they are by slumming it and self-consciously slumming it and eating Taco Bell with I mean, I love Taco Bell, so I want to include it. My husband took me to Taco Bell on our honeymoon. But I think that I think that it's something that I also it's something that really rung true to me. Like my friend Evan really loved Taco Bell, unironically, and almost like as a badge against it's almost like a marker that you're showing you're not part of the thing that you're part of.
Right.
Is that what you were going to say when you say
totally
what it was?
Well, yeah, totally. Because I think there is like an ironic, particularly in New York City, where it's a lot of the book takes place in New York City. And there's like not that many Taco Bells in New York City. And then the book moves to Philadelphia, and the character who lives in New York City is like, we have to go to Taco Bell because I can't access it that easily. But I mean, for me, I grew up in the original Taco Bell context, which is like, I am like a redneck from West Virginia, and like we used to go sit in the Taco Bell parking lot because there's nothing to do. So I don't eat it anymore. But like when I went to college, I would be like around this kind of thing, and I would be like, I don't, if I had all this money, I probably would be wearing nicer clothes and not eating at Taco Bell. But this is like why the codes are so like difficult to crack, right?
It speaks to the effortless thing. It also speaks to, I mean, there's a part in the book where like they just describing the entrance to a country club, right? And it's very nettled and like looks really, really shabby. I think it's an old money New England trope of,
Right.
being extremely thrifty and looking looking like you haven't bought new clothes in a generation, right? That everything is shabby, is actually, it's actually very chic, right? It shows the age of the money, right?
Yeah, exactly. Totally. I thought it was perfect. And like also there are like lots of different menu items from Taco Bell that are discussed. What else do we have? Okay. Someone asked, you said that when you were writing the book, it felt like a movie in your head. What actors would you cast as the 4 main characters?
So I actually just today got the news that I'm going to be working with a film agent, which is very exciting.
Oh yeah,
so I was talking with her the other day about, different people that I'd like to see, and she had some really good ideas. I love the idea of Florence Pugh as Diana, who played Amy in Little Women. I think she'd be amazing. I loved the idea of Colin Jost as Dale. I think that would be really, really good. I love the idea of Emmy Rossum as Vivian. The person that I had in my mind for Wes when I was writing it has since had some major personal issues, so I haven't been able to fan cast that character in my mind yet.
Okay.
So if you have any good ideas for Wes, like, text me.
Let me think about it. I don't know. I mean, well, who's had personal issues?
Oh, Armie Hammer, man.
He's too old though.
Yeah, maybe. But like the younger version of him who's, hasn't done those things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. One of the Chris's, right? Like how isn't one of the Chris's
could work for sure.
Yeah.
I think also it's tough because when I think of people, they're all people that are now too old.
Yeah, that's the thing. I know they're all like, I don't know the musicians, I don't know the actors, like I don't know their names. Florence Pugh is the only one.
So if you have a good idea,
but that's because she's dating Zach Braff.
Along to my new agent.
And Patrick Dorsey asks, in addition to the literary artistic Easter eggs that will no doubt be the focus of most of your enlightened audience, one imagines other readers, those who revel in the quote unquote froth, as you put it. The social and material details are so minutely observed that it's easy to imagine someone embracing this as a roadmap for aspirational improvement. How would that outcome interact with the thematic program that you set out earlier?
Ooh, that's a good question. Hi, Patrick. Patrick was in Jeff's society with me, which is with a debating society that the Patrick Henry Society in the novel is based on. That is a tough question. Remind me say that one more time.
Okay. So
the aspirations.
Right. The social material details are so minutely observed that it's easy. Basically, I think he's asking like, how would you feel? I think there's a lot of in contemporary criticism of novels. There's a lot of like, this is prescient. This is predicting of something, right? Yeah. And he's asking like, if someone sort of like read this book like without the irony, which is also a big discussion in contemporary criticism, right? Like people who like the prospect of like giving an ironic book to a reader who can't understand irony, right? Like what are they going to
dangerous? It's kind of like giving American Psycho to someone who, because I think American Psycho is a wonderful book and full of ironic, like very interesting ideas, but like it's a nightmare if you take it seriously. And I think, it's really, my book is probably the same way. I think it's it's probably somewhat of a dangerous novel in that case. But you know, I'm very, very much of the Oscar Wilde you know, mindset here, that there's no such thing as a moral or a moral book. Books are well written or badly written, and hopefully the book is well written. And I think that my reaction, if someone takes it unironically, is I'm very worried about the state of our public education system, and that we need to stop blaming immoral, bad literature for the problems of society, and start blaming the you know, structures and soulless corporations that actually contribute to it.
Yeah, I agree. And the final question is, are you doing anything else in the coming days to celebrate your book launch?
My friends Kyle and Tori are throwing me an in-person party on Saturday, and I'm so excited for it.
Yeah, that's
everyone's
great.
Vaccinated.
Yeah, everyone's vaccinated. It's a whole new world. Yeah, if there are any other questions, I think I got some, you know, some of what I wanted to say. Do you have anything else that you feel that you need to express about this book?
We didn't talk about Sophistry, Lauren.
Oh my God. Okay, let's talk about it. So we were in this other, I was doing another book talk with Alex McElroy, whose book is called The Atmospherians. And it's a really good satire. We were, I can't remember why we were talking about sophistry, but Natasha wrote in the chat that in fact sophistry is like quite fun to partake of, and I'm wondering if you could explain more about why that is.
I think that this is actually really related to Patrick's question. Yes. Because I think there's two types of sophistry. There's sophistry that is meant to deceive, and that is not fun, and that is a problem, and that is why we ended up with you know, pseudo dictator, would be actual dictator for 4 years. And then there is the kind of sophistry that is done without the desire to deceive, that is done for pure intellectual fun when everyone is in on the joke. And that is one of the most pleasurable, wonderful things that there is. It's the reason that my, you know, wonderful undergrad debate society was so much fun, which was, we, you know, would refer to as the Jefferson Society for Sophistry and Ad Hominem Attacks. And you know, whenever, so long as everybody's in on the joke, then it's a good time. Evan, who the inspiration for Julian again, his probationary presentation to the Jefferson Society was called "It's Getting Hot in Here in Defense of Sweatshops." And of course, something like this can only exist when everyone is agreed that of course we don't want to, of course we are not agreeing with this, right? But the intellectual gymnastics that you go through to defend something indefensible when everyone is of the understanding that is indefensible in light of like a modest proposal and Swift and etc. That's fun. There's very few things more fun than that.
Yeah, but is that sort of thing possible in the public sphere anymore?
I think that that's one of the great sadnesses of our current environment, and yet another reason that we need to improve our public education system.
That's great. Yes. So now, do you have anything else that you would like to say?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
To Greenlight. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Buy the book. It looks like this. It's wonderful.
Buy Lauren's book too. It's so.
I was saying that too. It's very fun, and I was like, Natasha, I hope you won't be offended if I say that the book is very fun, but it's like really fun to read, and she downplays you're like, there's no plot, but I think one of the classic plots is, will they fuck? And that is really what you're working with here. So
you have to read the book to find out.
Thank you very much.
What a note to end on. I love it. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you both for that fantastic discussion. And thanks everybody for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of The Portrait of a Mirror in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.